Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
In the last video, we were talking about inhibition and the sort of theory of what's a good type of inhibition and the bad type of inhibition, and how Alexander means it, and how you use inhibition in the initial Alexander technique. So I was wondering if you could give an example of what inhibition is and show us what inhibition means in practice, because it's kind of hard to understand for people if they haven't actually experienced the lesson.
Yes, that's well, I was expecting somebody to ask for something more practical. Yeah, you must understand that inhibition is a term that is used in the modern Alexander technique, and the view on inhibition in the modern Alexander technique is fairly simple, really. I have an example here of that kind of comments you will read. That's not the worst of them, of course. It's from Jennifer Tarr, which she wrote an interesting article back 10 years ago. And she said the key process of the Alexander technique is the inhibition of the initial desire to react to a particular stimulus in order to consider and apply conscious control to the response. So the customary way to discuss inhibition in the modern Alexander technique is two different moments. There is one moment for inhibition, one moment for direction. Direction is, in the modern Alexander technique, this idea that if you think a sentence, if you think let the neck be free, to let the head go forward and up, to let the back lengthen and widen, to let the knee go forward and away without doing anything, this is considered directions. This is considered the solution to most problems. So you inhibit your first reaction before doing a task, and you think that sentence, and normally everything good should ensue. Well, of course, this is difficult to believe, but most Alexander technique students do believe it at first, because it's like leaning on another concept, is that the good thing is going to come from repeated experiences brought about by gifted people that with their hands are capable somehow of educating your sensory appreciation. By the way, Jennifer Tarr articles is called Educating with the Hands. And so behind this idea of inhibition and direction, there is this idea that anyway, you're going to receive the correct experience from your teachers, and then the words of the directions of the customary direction, neck free, head forward and back to lengthen and widen, are going to have sense, to get meaning through the experience. So you're going just to think no and stop, and then somehow record your experiences, the feelings you had when you were manipulated by an external manipulator, a teacher. Hopefully the teacher was gifted, the teacher was a special individual that could read his sensory appreciation correctly. That's the idea. Well, now, the key process of the Alexander technique is inhibition of the initial desire to react to particular stimulus that triggered the bell in my memory. And the memory is from the second book of Alexander, of course, where you will find word for word the same start of a sentence. You will find also that the end of the sentence is slightly different. This again really means that in the application of my technique, the process of inhibition, that is the act of refusing to respond to the primary desire to gain an end, becomes the act of responding, volitionary act, to the conscious reasoned desire to employ the means whereby that end may be gained. If you compare the two sentences, you will find that the original is more complex than the one that has been put forward by Jennifer Tarr. She's taken the first part of the sentence, the part that is easy to understand, but the second part, the act of responding to the conscious reason desire to employ the means whereby that end may be gained, has been somehow lost in the translation. And so I thought it was important to understand what Alexander is talking about. And so very many people think that inhibition is of course, the heart of the Alexander technique. Well, I don't think it is. To say the truth, my idea is very, very different. And I do think that the art of the Alexander technique is the idea that you can or could carry out a series of verbal instruction describing a series of simultaneous movements, which we call the means whereby the coordination of the movement of the different parts of the organism on a general basis. So inhibition and direction share a common trait. They are both some sort of response to verbal orders. When you say you're using inhibition, you're using instructions of inhibition. When you say direction, you are using instruction that describe, well, for me, movements. So this is very different from the habitual sense of inhibition, the sense that is used in the modern Alexander technique. So I thought it was necessary, yes, before presenting a practical example, to go and discuss what I mean by inhibition. So when you are reading Alexander, you're always going to see that inhibition is associated with the means whereby principle. There is no book where Alexander separates means whereby and inhibition. Inhibition is part of the concept of the means whereby principle. And so it's necessary to have a look at what Alexander, means by means whereby. And he says the phrase means whereby will be used throughout this book to indicate the reason means to the gaining of an end. These means included the inhibition of the habitual use of the mechanism of the organism and the conscious projection of new directions necessary to the performance of the different acts involved in a new and more satisfactory use of these mechanisms. Now, I need to point out a great difficulty. The difficulty comes from the second part, not the inhibition here, but the second part. It's the conscious projection of new directions. And so Alexander always make a difference between inhibitory direction, the direction you should never do, let the neck be free, to let the head go forward and up, to let the back lengthen and widen, and new directions. New directions are never really explained in his books, never really explicitly defined. And so the conscious projection of new direction are necessary to the performance of the different acts involved in a new and more satisfactory use of the mechanisms. So the new and more satisfactory use of the mechanisms involve the performance of different acts. Well, for many Alexander teachers, this will sound quite strange. This will sound quite different from what they've learned, because the term inhibition is you should not do. And so in the modern Alexander technique, the idea is you should not do. The correct use of the mechanism should spring of itself, by just rehearsing the sentence and having a primary inhibition of desire to respond to an act. Then the new use should appear by itself. Or maybe by itself and helped by your memory of the feeling you had when you were manipulated by a teacher. I do think Alexander is talking of something completely different. So I wanted to point out these translations and or this description of his meaning before going into looking at a practical example of how I would tend to, well, use these ideas in, well, sessions of conscious guidance and control. So coming back to what I said last time, I was working with this idea that what is central is the proper carrying out of instructions. It's necessary, as you will see, Alex, I'm going to repeat that sentence. I'm showing another picture. And in that other picture, that's what Alexander is saying. The teacher should first discover if his pupil is reasonably correctly coordinated in those muscular uses of his organism, which are essential to the proper carrying out of instruction necessary to the performance of definite physical acts, demanding coordination in the use of the human body and limbs. And so the example I'm going to show is exactly responding to this directive. I really am following this idea. We are going to see and test a pupil and see whether the pupil has reasonable coordination in the muscular uses of his organism, and we are going to see if the pupil is capable of carrying out instruction in certain conditions and not in others, which is quite interesting in itself. So this is the description of the case. So we have here another sentence of Man's Supreme Inheritance, the first book of Alexander, and we are going to see that the new directions are detailed personal instructions, instructions that are given in connection with each exercise in its application to individual defects or peculiarities of the pupil. I'm just repeating what I'm reading at the moment, because on the screen, what you will see is a sentence that is taken from the first book, Man's Supreme Inheritance, in which Alexander says, in the first place, the tendency unduly to expand any part or parts of the thorax in particular to the exclusion of other parts is prevented by the detailed personal instruction given in connection with each exercise in its application to individual defects or peculiarity of the pupil. So I have here the example of a pupil that has a tendency to unduly expand some parts of the thorax in particular to the exclusion of other parts. So this is what you're going to see here. This is a pupil during a long distance lesson, and we have a pupil that is standing in front of a chair, and it's obvious. The pupil is arching the back, and I have indicated some arrows to show how the pupil, what are the means whereby to this arching of the back. And I'm going to demonstrate that that pupil is expanding the thorax in an incorrect way. So here you see that, of course, the pupil is standing. So we see some actions of the lower leg and upper leg that are, in fact, leading to having the front of the torso, the abdomen leading forward. That person is leading with the abdomen in front of the ankle, and the abdomen is also in front of the head. This is the abdomen leading posture. Well, the abdomen leading posture is only possible because the pupil is pulling back very strongly with the upper thoracic spine, and therefore, as the cervical spine is attached to the thoracic spine, we can see that the pupil has the neck pulled back and the head likewise. That the head is back, yes, and the abdomen is forward. Well, this is how the pupil starts her lesson. And so Alexander is using the term process very often, And I found with my own students that the term process was not that clear in most of my students. And so when we talk about the tendency unduly to expand some parts of the thorax to the exclusion of other parts, we are discussing a process. I've given the definition I'm using. A process is a given number of simultaneous action which produce a result. And so what you're looking at the moment is the definition of process, well, in a practical act of standing. What you see is that the person has the lower part of the rib cage very far forward and the upper part of the rib cage very far back. Hence, you have a direction for the sternum bone, that is the frontal plane of the torso, that is really pulled backward at the top. When that happens, I often need to explain to my pupil, make a little experiment to show them that when you are using, of course, the different parts in this way, when you are directing the movement in this way, what happens is that the lower part of the front of the rib cage is really expanded. Yeah. It's unduly expanded at the exclusion of the back of the lower rib cage that is unduly shortened and narrowed. So there is a very simple way to establish that fact, is to ask a person to just open thumb and index and bring the thumb and index to, well, encircle the lower rib cage, so that you have the index at the front touching the front ribs, the lower front ribs, and the thumbs at the back touching the back ribs. And so the game is very simple. Once the hands are placed in the way indicated, with the thumb at the front of the lower rib cage and the index at the back of the lower rib cage, I will make the pupil know that this has a tendency to augment. What we see on this picture is that the person is wearing the lower rib cage very far forward of the upper part of the mechanism of the arm. So as you can see, the arms are really retracted very far backward to help, in fact, compensate all the weight that is being thrown forward, the thigh, the middle torso forward. So to compensate, the person is shortening the back and pulling the arms very far backward. So in order to check if, yes, Alexander is correct, there is a tendency to expand unduly the lower part of the thorax relatively to the lower part, well, I just ask the person to start to direct antagonistic movements. These are the new directions I'm discussing that Alexander is pointing out. And so this is what the person is, the person at the moment is just looking at the thumb and index. I had the person look at the thumb and index in order to force use of the mechanism of the arm. So the mechanism of the arm would not move backward with the torso. In order to inhibit that habitual coordination of the movement of the parts of the arm and the parts of the torso, well, I just use simple instruction to bring the hand forward and expand the finger, and the person is going to be really intent on expanding the fingers. It's something she's directing her attention to, while I'm asking her to start directing the use of the other parts. And you will see, if you compare the two images, that of course the back, the lower back of the person is going back. And it's maybe possible for you to imagine that if you got these strong creases here, very visible creases on the pullover, you will find that when the person is now directing the parts in the way requested, you can see that there is an expansion. It doesn't mean that there is a collapse of the front. It means just that now the thorax is starting to expand coordinatedly. Yes, and there is a possibility now to not only expand the lower thorax, but also to expand the whole thorax. So here again, you could use the definition of process, an established group of acts that are carried out in a series in order to reach an endpoint or to reach a goal. The goal here is to, of course, stand upright. Very often, I do not explain beforehand what is the goal of a procedure. Because if you say to the person, I'm going to have you lengthen in standing, or I'm going to have you stand and benefit from the aid, and so that you are influenced by the force of gravity, as Alexander explained in his books. Well, very often the person knowing the goal is going to interfere. The person is going to try to reach the goal by subconscious means. These are not subconscious means. These are conscious intentions of movement that have been described explicitly in words. So many people would say, but where is inhibition in this? The person is performing acts. The person is involved in doing a series of movements. Yes, that's absolutely correct. I take another example from Alexander's book. This is another quote. And Alexander is talking of a previous book, of course. This is Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual, the second book, but he's discussing a passage of his first book in it. That's where he says, I there attempted, there means the first book. And in the first book, there is a chapter that is discussing a process in golf. So that's what he's talking about. And he said, in this book, I attempted to make clear that the success of any particular process in golf, such as, for instance, following through, must depend primarily on the general condition of psychophysical development and control present. Because a player whose sensory appreciation is in any way at fault cannot satisfactorily carry out directions given to him. It's a very strange sentence to look at just after looking at a pupil. That pupil is clearly at a stage of subconscious guidance, and she's now working with a conscious guidance teacher, who is telling her instructions of movements. And we see that when she's receiving these instructions from the teacher, she is capable of really changing our habitual use. So it seems to be in contradiction with what Alexander is saying, because he says that the pupil cannot satisfactorily carry out these directions given to him. And this is an argument that is used every time in the modern Alexander technique to, convince people that it's only through the manipulation of a gifted manipulator that they can reach the correct use of the self. Yeah. Well, in fact, we see that maybe the sentence is wrong, because we see that the pupil is capable of modifying our posture and going toward we see that the abdomen is not leading so much now, or the thighs. We see that the head is starting to go forward. We see that the back is lengthening, and there is much less contraction on the neck. So where is the catch? Well, the catch is he cannot satisfactorily carry out direction given to him. That is this pupil, which is guided by faulty sensory appreciation. Well, yes, but this is what is missing, is that as long as the pupil is guided by his faulty sensory appreciation, if no new directions are given to him, of course, this sentence is absolutely true. If you ask a person to react to the sentence, neck free, head forward, and up, back to lengthen and widen, this is exactly what you're going to see. The person cannot absolutely not carry out these directions given to him. And the idea is that he should not intend to carry out these decisions or these directions of movement that have been given to him. And so in the case of the pupil, we see that in certain conditions, when it is the teacher that is presenting the directions, and rehearsing the direction for the pupils, because the capacity of the pupil, what we call the condition of psychophysical development and control present, is that you are giving an instruction to the pupil. Well, very often the pupil is going to try immediately and translate that instruction in something that the pupil can feel. As a result, the condition of psychophysical development is very low, and obviously the person is going to forget that direction as soon as you get a second one, because the second one is going to be treated in the same way as the first. The person is going to try to feel that new direction, and when the pupil feels the second directions, the second order given to her, then well, the feeling of the first is going to immediately disappear and be replaced by the new one. Therefore, the two instructions are not going to be simultaneous and cohabitate in the mind of the pupil. One is going to be wiped out by the second. So no wonder the pupil is not capable of carrying out directions given to her. But if the teacher takes over the rehearsing part, if I give the directions to the person, making the person understand that the two new orders mean something together, then it's possible for the pupil, as you've seen, to change our orientation. So the general condition of psychophysical development and control present means simply the pupil's capacity to keep in mind, to direct his attentions. I've put an S at attentions. I'm reading a sort of picture I'm showing on the screen. And I say the capacity to keep in mind and direct his attentions despite the feeling present. He can keep in mind different mental objects. And it's also a capacity, therefore, if he can keep in mind the different mental objects, to carry out the actions, the direction of movement when under a mental, emotional, and sensory load. I need to explain this. Very often, people are reasoning quite well, yes, but as soon as some strong stimulus comes in, the person feels something or sees something, or suddenly as a physical feeling, you will find that the person will tend to focus on the strongest feeling. When you say focus, you mean that the light of attention is now centered onto something, and the tendency is for the rest of the field of mind to get in the dark, to disappear more or less in the dark. And so the person is not keeping his attentions together. The person is suddenly throwing every part of his capacities onto, well, responding to the feeling. The point in the conscious guidance and control lessons is to have the pupil being capable of maintaining his attentions going, continuing to direct his attention in different directions. There is what he feels, but there is also the reasoning that have been placed with different mental objects and different instructions all together. So that is the idea. The idea of inhibition is not to inhibit certain ideas, and, for example, inhibiting what we feel is impossible. What is possible, though, is to inhibit our primary reaction, which is to concentrate our attention on one kind of stimulus. We want mental stimulus, we want geometrical stimulus, we want sensory stimulus to cohabitate. And that is what is called the load, the mental load. So we are going to see now how I use this idea. I'm going to take just the first part of an experiment of conscious guidance that is, in fact, well, guided with the same pupil that had a tendency to unduly expand certain parts of the chest at the expense of others. So we are going to see that Alexander points the finger and he says that the person is incapable of carrying out given orders. And we are going to look at his explanation, and I'm going to try and recenter the discussion, because there is an obvious solution where we can understand this sentence very simply, or we can try and use our reasoning to understand what it really means. And that's my point, of course. So here is the sentence where Alexander explains this failure to carry out given orders. And this is from the second book, of course. This failure to carry out the given orders is due chiefly to the fact that the pupil's sensory appreciation in the matter of due and proper muscular tension is sadly inadequate. So when the simplest way to understand this would be to say that, well, so the pupil cannot carry out the given orders. So the pupil is given simultaneous new orders of movements. And he says that Alexander says the pupil failure is due to what the pupil feels. That if the pupil were to feel correctly, to have a correct feeling, a correct estimation of what he feels, he would be able to carry out the given orders. I want to show that this does not make sense in the pure first reaction to this sentence, or first intellectual reaction, is to think, okay, it's simple. I just need to have lesson with somebody who is going to give me what we call a correct sensory appreciation, and then I will be able to carry out the orders. So it's something very common. Many teachers think that if the pupil receives enough sensory experiences of the correct adjustment given by the teacher, then the pupil is going to be able to carry out the instruction given. The orders, for example, make free and forward and up, back to lengthen and widen, the pupil is going to be able to carry out these orders. And of course, you can imagine that the pupil is going to be able to carry out also the order of inhibition, to inhibit the primary desire to respond to the stimulation. Well, to me, this does not make sense, really, because I can't see how feeling the correct tension can give the pupil the capacity to have many ideas, many orders, many instructions in mind in order to process them and to perform the action simultaneously. Even if each action that has to be performed is going to change the sensory background. And every time the sensory background is going to be different. So to me, that made very little sense. I have a way to make this plausible, is to say that it's possible that the pupil does not appreciate the sensory inputs at their true value. But what is the idea is that it's possible that the pupil is going too much value to the sensory stimuli. There are other stimuli, there are the intellectual ones. So you've been asked to keep in mind to, well, use your memory. So you have to have your attention directed not only to the feeling that you are going to receive when you're trying to perform simultaneous procedure with actions that are all together, but of course, you have to understand that if you follow these instructions, if you carry out the instructions, of course, you're going to have very strong feelings. I swear. You will see. The procedure I'm going to show elicit very strong feelings. And so many people are overestimating the feelings, the sensation. They are considering that certain feelings are like an overwhelming trigger to an habitual series of action. Of course, I cannot do anything else but that. What I'm doing at the moment because of the feeling I receive. If I feel so much out of balance, I have to, cement my stability somehow. That is where we are going to discuss the decisions that are made. Yeah, we are going to see that at first it's going to be very, very difficult in these conditions for the pupil that has been capable. So we have a pupil, the pupil has been capable of lengthening the back, of directing the head forward of the abdomen, or better to direct the abdomen backward relatively to the head. That is possible, yes, but we will see that in different conditions, it's not going to be that easy for her, and she will be incapable of carrying out the instructions given to her. So I'm coming back to Alexander's explanation before showing the little procedure. He says, the inhibitory process involved in my technique has little in common with that to which reference has just been made. For the idea concerned with inhibition in my technique is conceived on a general and preventive basis, and the process of inhibition involved is employed primarily in connection with ideas which are disassociated from any direct attempt to gain an end, but associated instead with that indirect procedure inseparable from the practical application of the principles concerned with the means whereby an end may be gained. We have already seen that sentence, but I wanted to use the demonstration today of a practical procedure in order to try and explain what Alexander is talking about. I have found that it was necessary for the pupil to understand the ideas which could be associated with a direct attempt to gain an end. And that is what we are going to see now. So here is the same pupil seen from the front this time. We remember this pupil has a tendency to unduly expand certain parts of the chest, particularly the front, the lower part of the chest. And in this procedure, you can see the student is standing with one leg forward, one leg back. That has been requested of her, of course. And also, I have requested her to hold the elbows with the hands. And not only that, but also to make sure that the forearms are very close to the abdomen. Then, simple instruction, I ask her to take a step back. And that is all. That is the procedure. Or, as you will see, there are conditions in this experiment that I need to explain. So this is, first of all, you must understand that this happens during a long distance session. I am not in the same room as the person, I'm miles away. Yeah. So the person is alone, and she's facing a camera. That's the condition. And understanding the emotional conditions of the procedure now. The pupils knows, because it's her room, and she knows there is a chair behind her, a chair that represents an obstacle. Yeah, she does not know exactly how many steps she must make before touching the chair. So we have here a request of movement in the presence of an unseen obstacle. The chair represents an unseen obstacle, and it adds to the mental load. There is for most people, walking backward, knowing that there is a chair somewhere, is not that easy a situation. It's not a cocooning session. We see that the pupil has to solve a task. The task is not just to be there. The task is to respond to the conditions, of course. So I have explained the purpose of holding the elbows with the hands. The pupil already has a story concerning why she's requested to hold the hands. And she's requested to hold the hands, but not only. She's also requested to carry out a decision to direct the movement of the arms downward. It's not only to make sure that the forearm are staying against the lower rib cage, but she's requested to, in fact, direct the movement of the arm downwards and to continue to do that when stepping back. It's an understanding between the student and the teacher. Well, you could say she is to inhibit any movement of the forearm forward relatively to the torso or upward relatively to the torso. And a reasonable explanation has been given to her. I have explained that any disequilibrium backwards, I said, well, let's imagine that you while making a step backward, you are suddenly hitting an obstacle. Well, of course, we have discussed the chair before that, so she has more or less an idea of what I'm talking about. So I say, well, yes, imagine that while walking back, you hit an obstacle. What would happen if you lift the shoulders? If you pull the upper torso backwards, of course, directing the movement of the upper torso means directing the movement of the neck, because the spine that is part of the upper torso is also, well, the main support of the neck and head. So therefore, if you start lifting the arms and, of course, lifting the elbows forward relatively to the torso, you're going to send the upper torso backward. And we know you have a tendency for that type of disequilibrium, so that will augment your the probability of falling backwards. It is dangerous. So we had an emotional value to the inhibition of lifting the arms. Well, I had that emotional value. I say, do you understand that if you lift the arms and you eat something, you're going to be more in danger? So we want to reduce danger using verbal instructions. That's it. So apparently, I am proposing to use verbal instruction to secure the person, but you must understand that if you start a lesson like this, you are not really securing the person. The person is going to be very, unbalanced by all these preparation. Most people would take a step or two back without thinking so much. Well, I noticed that when that person was requested to step back, she was immediately bending down to one side and looking back to see where the obstacle was. So the pupil really understand there is a difficulty in that procedure. And so this is the first step, how the person is taking the first. That's the first step in the process. I don't know if you notice, but no step has been made. The pupil is preparing. There is a preliminary movement to taking a step back. I use the definition of step is moving a foot backward to support the torso. Yeah. So what we have here is on the subconscious plane of guidance. I have not given the pupil any directions of movement for the different parts of the organism, apart from the upper torso direction of movement. I said, make sure that the elbows, both elbows, stay very close to the torso. So, well, of course, I'm asking the person to take a step back while the arms are moving at the same speed backward. That is the only conscious instruction I've given to the pupil. Yeah. And so the process of taking a step back starts with a preliminary movement. in which the pupil is throwing her weight onto the supporting leg, and as you will see, onto the outside of the foot. She's interfering with her balance, and she's also interfering with what Alexander called the proper position of the torso. It's not seen on this picture, but of course, the person has, in disturbing her own equilibrium, she has reverted to our habitual use of the movements of the parts of the torso, and she's much closer to this form seen from the side than from this one. Now she has taken a step backward. Taking a step backward is interfering with the proper lengthening and widening of the torso. You will also see that in this preliminary movement, so the desire to load the torso onto one foot, to load the torso onto the supporting foot, she's making a movement to the side to bring the torso onto what she thinks is the supporting leg. She's preparing to move, of course, the left leg back, and she's inhibiting the idea that has been previously given to her of maintaining both shoulders movement downward. Yeah, you see on the move, the side she prepares to move is the left side. You see that on the left side, she's lifting the left arm, clearly. Yeah, I'm sure that the contact between the front of the forearm and the chest is much less than before. She's lifting and starting to direct the movement of the forearm forward, which was explicitly requested, and she understood the reasoning behind the idea not to do that kind of movement. Apparently, she cannot perform what she's been instructed. She cannot carry out the instruction. She cannot inhibit the movement that are associated with a preliminary idea. She thinks that she has to move the foot back. Well, you would say, yes, that's what we asked her to do. Well, her strategy to move the foot back involves preliminary movement that are disturbing her equilibrium. And very interestingly, when she does that sort of loading of the leg, it's exactly what Alexander described. I have a picture here where there are two graphics and the sentence. We have already seen that sentence, but I wanted to connect the ideas. Alexander is saying in the use of the self, in the third book, that's what I'm going to read, I observed that this condition of undue muscle tension affected particularly the use of my leg, feet, and toes, my toes being contracted and bent downwards in such a way that my feet were unduly arched, while weight thrown more on the outside of my feet than it should have been, and my balance interfered with. My point here is that it's exactly the description Alexander is making. It corresponds to what that person is doing when she thinks that she has to move backward. The process of taking a step back, involves a preliminary movement that in fact loads the outside of the foot, and has a tendency, because when you load the outside of the foot, of course, you're slightly out of balance. The weight of the torso is not now fully supported by both legs, and so there is an undue activity of the flexor muscle they are called extensor here, but they are extending the toes, they are lifting the toes off the floor, and so this is associated with too much feet, too much load on the outside of the foot, and it's associated with the wrong use of the mechanism of the toe, foot, ankle, and knee mechanism. So when she's landing, this is, you see, first image, second image, and third image. So we see this how the process of the step is taking. First, the preliminary movement, and then second, going and landing on, again, the outside of the left foot. And the torso is clearly way away from its base. The person, of course, is creating conditions where she is, of course, falling to one side and to the other. This, of course, has been described by Alexander. And Alexander is saying the mechanical disadvantage displayed in what is known as a rolling gait, a gait which is common enough, is absolutely impossible when the instructions given are carefully followed. Wow. Alexander recognizes the problem. Yeah. He knows that most people have a tendency to initiate steps while, in fact, carrying the weight onto the supporting foot. Therefore, the position of the torso is threatened. And that happens because the person has a strategy which is to bring the foot back while cementing the stability onto the supporting foot. When the first idea is to get one leg equilibrium. So instead of taking a step back, the person does not take a step back to start with. The person steps aside. The person wants to take the load onto the supporting foot. This is the primary desire. Yeah, the primary desire, as I say, is to cement the stability onto one leg. The person thinks that there is, or believes there is no other way to take a step back. There is, like here, the primacy of, well, the end. The end is to move one foot back. So in order to move one foot back, I have to move one foot back, keeping my equilibrium. Therefore, I need to take the load onto the supporting foot. I am going to shorten the torso because it's necessary. I am going to expand some parts of the torso at the expense of others because it's necessary. And it's necessary because I feel it is. The reasoning has very little part in this, well, procedure, in this test. Yeah. So how do we use inhibition then? The person is at the moment not capable of directing according to the instructions given to her. She is not inhibiting the primary movement. She's not continuing to direct the movement of the elbows downwards and close to the body. Therefore, she's creating condition of disequilibrium. Well, there is only one way, and it's to, in fact, speak to our intellectual attention. And so I'm going to explain again the reason why she's asked to hold the elbows together, because I knew she had a rolling gait to start with. So the primary desire to cement the stability is very, very strong. The person wants to take a step back feeling stable. It's necessary for her to feel stable. The difficulty is that the solution involves poise, involves equilibrium. And equilibrium is not the same thing as feeling stable. So I said to her, you see, I ask you to, in fact, carry your elbows and keep your elbows closed. We have already discussed this, yes. But that means that when you move backward, the movement, the relative movement of both external parts of the arms is going to be more or less adjusted, more or less balanced. That is, the speed of the external part of the left arm and the speed of the external part of the right arm are going to be much or less the same. Yeah, and at the moment, what we want is that we want that the center line of the torso, where the sternum is, the lower part of the sternum is, we want that to be going backward faster than the two movements of the external parts of the arms. We are starting to discuss movements. Yes, and we think, okay, we want to move both external part of the arm backward at more or less the same speed as the lower sternum. We don't want the arms to be faster than the lower sternum, because if they are, it means that you're starting to arch the back from above. And we don't want that. We want to keep the primacy of the torso in the movement. So the torso move back first, the external part of the arms move second. And so this is called, Alexander has a definition or a label for that. It's quite interesting. He says, reeducating a pupil on a general basis to a reliable plane of conscious activity. Quite reeducating the pupil on a general basis to a reliable plane of conscious activity. We want the pupil to start expanding her attentions, so that, of course, she's going to feel very strong stimuli, but at the same time, could she have a very compact, explicit understanding of the movements of the different parts, so that it makes a whole? So we have to explain the difference between the idea of moving the foot and the idea of moving the torso as a primary goal. That is, the pupil must understand that when she moves the foot, in fact, she moves the torso. At the moment, our idea is to move the foot before moving the torso. Could it be possible to move the torso before moving the limbs? So the first thing is, we can explain that, yes, apparently without much difficulty, the pupil can move, well, the external part of the upper limb after moving the middle torso. So the next question is quite simple. We can define the external part of the lower limb as we have defined the external part of the upper limb. And that's why I'm going to have her define. So I say, well, we are discussing the bone of the thigh, which we call the femur. There is a photo of the femur on the right of that picture. And I say, well, you see, the femur has a body, a long axis, but it has a neck and a head. And the tendency is for the neck to be directed inward relatively to the long axis, to the body of the femur. That's the photograph I'm showing. And so there is a very easy bony part to locate on that object of the anatomical structure, is what I call the trochanter spot. The trochanter spot is the most external part of the limb. So moving the torso as a primary goal relatively to the external part of the arm is already accepted. Well, now we see that when the pupil is moving backward, obviously, yeah, the speed of the different parts of the external part of the limb is completely different. Of course, she's taking a step back. So when she's taking a step back, we see that there in one well, the front leg is nearly, external part is nearly not moving, while she's accelerating the other part enormously behind the torso. So that part is the part that is moving, the leg that is moving the trochanter very fast backward relatively to the torso. So my question here is simple. I say the only way to inhibit that preliminary movement that distorts the position of the torso, distorts the coordination of the torso, is that is inhibiting the idea of moving the foot before the torso, must be inhibited. But you have to have new orders. You have to be very clear about what should be moving and at what speed. And so a new idea starts to emerge, that is that the person could move both trochanters backward, yes, after moving the torso, and continue to move both trochanters backward at the same speed as the torso is moving. very often, at that moment, when realizing what I've got, what is my story leading to, the person says, no, it's impossible. I cannot accelerate both trochanters at the same speed and slower than the torso. Why? Well, because the legs are moving. No. That's exactly what I'm discussing. It's because the legs are moving, that both legs are moving, that you can start imagining that it's necessary to adjust the speed of both legs. But the pupil suddenly realizes that her first desire is not to move the supporting leg. The first desire of the pupil is to, when I say cement the stability, the idea behind cement is an unmoving structure to support something moving. So the pupil has in mind that she can, in fact, stay stable over one leg by suppressing the movement. So that is, of course, the wrong kind of inhibition. She's inhibiting a movement. Well, that is more or less impossible to inhibit. So the only way she can do that is at first, and she will get a feeling that she's doing what she thinks she's doing, because instead of moving back with the supporting trochanter, the supporting external part of the leg, she's going to go sideways. So she's refusing to go back with the supporting leg. And so we are going to see that to inhibit that primary desire, well, she must accept a feeling of disequilibrium. For her, moving the supporting external part of the leg means immediately that I am falling. So at first, of course, she will fall, accelerating the external part of the arms faster than the trochanters. And I say, yes, absolutely. You're making yourself arch the back and you're leading the way with your head, and obviously you're falling. Could you now try to link up in your mind the movement of the external part of the limbs, of the lower limb, with the external part of the upper limb? Could you imagine in your mind moving, in fact, for example, the trochanter slightly faster together than the external part of the arms? Oh, yes, that is possible. And she will discover a new feeling that, yes, everything is there for her to feel out of balance, but because she can direct a proportional movement between the inferior part of the system and the superior part of the external arm, she suddenly does not feel the fall so much. She feels the movement. And she discovered that she can, move the foot that is on the opposite side without bending the knee so much, as if suddenly she was capable of using the muscle of the back that are there, to lift the leg. So Alexander says that these ideas are the response to a stimulus or stimuli arising from the reason, constructive, conscious understanding and acceptance by the pupil of the principles concerned with the means whereby. And as the procedure concerned with the application of these principles involve the prevention of end-gaining acts, the performance of which is associated with misdirected activities, it follows that the pupil's acceptance of the need for and efficacy of such procedure includes also the acceptance of the principle of inhibition of primary desires concerned with such end-gaining acts, meaning that the pupil is going to understand her need to inhibit the primary desire. So let's review this. So the principle of the means whereby is that when you are taking a step back, you're involved in a process, the process of, moving the torso somewhere in space. And the principle of the means whereby introduces the primary act as being the movement of the torso and not the movement of the limbs. We don't want to move the neck. We don't want to move the arm. We don't want to move the legs first. We want to understand that we need to move the torso first. So we move the torso first, and the idea is to move backward. The idea is not to move to the side, because we know that we have here the prevention of end-gaining acts. The person is trying to gain the end while feeling stable, while directing the movement with their sensory appreciation. And we know that these acts, well, leading the load very far outside the supporting leg is associated with misdirected activities. It's easy to show to the pupil taking the picture from the side, taking a step from the side while being filmed, that, well, all our preliminary acts lead to shortening the back, of unduly expanding the same part of the chest as we wanted to expand. But we are not anymore into a static position of standing where you're directing movements and, well, there is very little threat to your equilibrium. There is, but it's for the moment hidden. When you're taking a step back with a chair behind you, I can tell you, of course, the misdirected activities have a necessary end. You want absolutely to secure your balance. You want to stop movement on one side and promote movement on the other side, which is totally disrupting the coordination of the mechanism of the torso. So the pupil must understand that she has to inhibit the primary desires concerned with that primary act. And it's not something that is simply intellectual. We see that the attention must be, in fact, expanded to include, of course, you have a reasoning. You know that at the moment, this sequence of events, when the external part of the legs are really accelerated unduly on one side and stop to move on the other side, is leading to that rolling gait. Yeah. And so I haven't had the time to show the image that are showing the new way of taking a step back, but this will be for another time.
So to summarize, the main difference between, well, a big difference between inhibition in the modern Alexander technique and the initial Alexander technique is that the modern way is it's more simple. It's too simple. So the idea is you inhibit, then you give directions, then you just do whatever happens. You just trust it to happen. Whereas in the initial Alexander technique, there's like three ways you could look at inhibition. There's the inhibition you decide to not just immediately go into action, to decide not to end game at the start. You're going to reason out the best means for the goal. There's the inhibition where you're inhibiting during the process of the actions. You're inhibiting certain movements that you don't want to see. You're suppressing movements that you don't want, that you decided in advance. And then there's also you're inhibiting your reaction to bad feelings and emotional things that come up as you're doing the new movements. So it's a initial Alexander technique. You're inhibiting all the way through the process. It's much more complex because there's many things happening at once. Whereas the modern Alexander technique is too simple.
Yeah, the other difference is that in the initial technique as we teach it, you cannot separate inhibition from the concept of new orders. It's not just you inhibit and you recite your neck free at forward and back to infinite widen. You need to understand what are the orders and what the orders are for. The orders are for organizing the movement as a whole. And you must understand the cause and effect links that are, in fact, wrapping up all these movements into one act. So yes, I agree with you. Our definition of inhibition is much more complex. There are not three, but many more. You just mentioned three, but I can imagine a few more just out of my head like this. When the person has to inhibit the idea of taking a step back. It's just to play a word. You say, take a step back. And the person will say, no, I should not take a step back because my conception of taking a step back is the process that is already inscribed in my sensory appreciation of cementing the load onto the supporting leg. I need to think, okay, I need to have the means whereby orders in mind. And I must keep the inhibition going while moving, despite the fact that I'm going to feel out of balance immediately, that I start moving the external part of the supporting leg. For many people, that moment of moving the trochanter of the supporting leg is like a big threat. And so inhibition in that at that moment means the capacity to expand attention away from the immediate feeling, so to liberate oneself from the direct stimulation of sensory appreciation and keep in mind the other orders that are reasoned out. Yes, and that continued inhibition is something you cannot invent. You have to construct it using procedures. You have to have somebody helping you, confronting these experiences where you are supposed to, take into action the ideas. And so inhibition cannot be separated from the correct performance of the new orders. So yes, it's much more complex, much more interesting also. And suddenly the pupil has an explicit definition of what we are talking about. It's not just say no, just say pause. No. There is no, we are not asking the pupil to stop the movement. We are going to ask the pupil to do exactly what is said. You want to take a step. You don't want to go to the side for the moment. The step is back.
And now you can actually see the direct results of inhibition. You see whether they managed to prevent a certain movement or not. You can see it on video.
Yeah,
You're not just having to go by their feeling inside of whether they were inhibiting or not.
Yes, they are going to see the result of their inhibition. They are going to see, first of all, on video, but also once the shock is past. But there is a shock when you're asked to do something against your own habitual sense of equilibrium. There is a shock. I have had pupils saying, my legs are shaking. I say, yeah, it's maybe you had a shock or something. Yeah, it's like a threat. And so how do you open your attentions when you are under threat? That's a very good question, and it's a question that is related to the original question of the pupil that say, how do I organize my mind regarding emotions? Well, very often you must take a very active test in order to know that you can really change regard your attention's span when you're under threat. The threat is a stimuli for very strong emotions.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Jeando. For people watching the video, you can book a lesson with Jeando if you go underneath to find his email address and his website, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.